Imagine waking before dawn in a city that smells of coal smoke and horse manure, where the river running through your town is so thick with human waste that fish have not been seen in it for a generation. You are 7 years old and you have a 12-hour shift waiting for you underground. Above you, in a palace less than 2 miles away, a queen is sitting down to a breakfast of 6 courses, served on gold plates surrounded by 400 servants. This is Britain in the 1840s, the richest nation on earth and one of the cruelest places in it. This documentary will take you inside that world, from the throne room to the coalface, to tell the full story of the age that made us. In the summer of 1815, the guns fell silent across Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated at Waterloo, and Britain emerged from more than 2 decades of almost continuous warfare as the most powerful nation on earth. The Royal Navy ruled the seas. British manufacturing fed armies and clothed continents. And yet, for the ordinary men and women who had sacrificed so much, victory brought not prosperity, but suffering. The soldiers came home to find no work waiting. The Corn Laws of 1815, passed to protect wealthy landowners, kept bread prices cruelly high while wages collapsed. Across the industrial north, in the smoking mill towns of Manchester and Leeds, families went hungry. The ruling class, those Georgian aristocrats in their country houses, seemed not merely indifferent but actively hostile to the misery spreading beneath them. Tension rose through the years that followed, building like steam in a sealed vessel. Then, on the 16th of August, 1819, it exploded. 60,000 peaceful protesters gathered at St. Peter's Field in Manchester, demanding parliamentary reform. The local magistrates, panicking at the sight of such an enormous crowd, ordered cavalry to charge into the unarmed men, women, and children. 18 people were killed. Hundreds were wounded. The massacre was named Peterloo, a bitter mockery of Waterloo's glory, and it became a rallying cry for a generation of radicals who understood that Britain's political system was rotting from within. And rotten it truly was. In the unreformed Parliament of the 1820s, the ancient borough of Old Sarum returned 2 members of Parliament to Westminster despite having not a single resident. Meanwhile, the booming industrial city of Manchester, home to hundreds of thousands, had no representation whatsoever. The system served the aristocracy and no one else. Change, when it finally came, was wrenching. After years of agitation, mass protests, and genuine fear of revolution, the Great Reform Act of 1832 passed into law. It swept away the worst of the rotten boroughs and extended the vote to a larger portion of the middle class. It was not democracy, not yet, but it was the first admission that the old order could not hold forever. 1 year later, Parliament struck a blow of genuine moral weight. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 over 800,000 enslaved people across the British Empire. The slaveholders received £20 million in compensation. The enslaved received nothing but their freedom. It was a profound and incomplete justice, but it marked Britain's self-conscious turn towards something it wished to believe about itself. By 1837, Britain stood at a threshold. The old Georgian world, corrupt and hierarchical and brutal in its indifference, was giving way. The factories multiplied. The railways were coming. And in Kensington Palace, an 18-year-old girl was about to wake to the news that she was queen. In the early hours of June the 20th, 1837, two men arrived at Kensington Palace and demanded to be admitted. They had urgent news. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain had ridden through the night, and when they were finally shown into a room, the young woman who appeared before them had been pulled from sleep. Her hair was loose. She wore a dressing gown. She was 18 years old, and she was Queen of England. William IV had died at Windsor at 12 minutes past 2 in the morning. His reign had been brief and largely undistinguished. Now the crown passed to his niece, and Victoria, by every account, met the moment with a composure that surprised those who expected a frightened girl. She received her visitors alone. That word alone carried enormous significance. For nearly her entire life, she had never once been permitted to be alone. The woman responsible for that suffocating supervision was her own mother, the Duchess of Kent. Under the influence of her controlling advisor, John Conroy, the Duchess had imposed what became known as the Kensington system, a regime designed to keep Victoria isolated, dependent, and obedient. Victoria had slept in her mother's room every night of her life. She had never been allowed to walk downstairs without someone holding her hand. The intention was to ensure that when Victoria became queen, she would need her mother and Conroy beside her. The strategy failed completely. From the first days of her reign, Victoria made her independence plain. She excluded her mother from private audiences. She relied instead on her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, a charming and worldly Whig politician nearly 40 years her senior. Melbourne became her guide, her confidant, her political tutor. Critics whispered that their closeness was improper. Victoria simply adored him. The relationship was not without consequence. In the spring of 1839, Melbourne's government faced defeat in Parliament and prepared to resign. Protocol required Victoria to invite the incoming Conservative leader, Robert Peel, to form a government. Peel made one request: that several of Victoria's ladies of the bedchamber, most of them wives of prominent Whigs, be replaced with ladies connected to his own party. Victoria refused outright. Peel declined to take office. Melbourne returned. It was called the bedchamber crisis, and while Victoria had won the immediate battle, she had stumbled into a controversy that revealed how much she still had to learn about constitutional limits. The young queen had allowed personal loyalty to override political judgment. Melbourne himself gently acknowledged that she had pushed the boundaries of her prerogative. It would not be the last lesson she needed to absorb. Yet the public saw something quite different from a queen making political miscalculations. They saw youth and novelty and possibility. When Victoria processed through London for her coronation on the 28th of June, 1838, the crowds were extraordinary. The ceremony itself was a magnificent shambles. One lord dropped the orb, another forced the coronation ring onto the wrong finger so painfully that Victoria later had to soak it free in ice water. But none of it dampened the electric enthusiasm of the watching thousands. Britain had grown weary of elderly, dissolute kings. Here was something entirely new. A young woman on the throne of the most powerful empire on earth, navigating politics and ceremony and the weight of history with a striking, unpolished determination. The Victorian age had a name. Now it needed a shape. Giving it that shape would depend, more than anyone yet understood, on a single meeting with a young German prince. The meeting had been carefully arranged. In October of 1839, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha arrived at Windsor Castle for a visit that both families understood to be more than social. Victoria had met her German cousin 3 years earlier and found him pleasant but unremarkable. This time, something was entirely different. Within days, she was lost. Albert was tall, graceful, and possessed of a seriousness that complemented her own passionate nature. The difficulty of the situation fell entirely on Victoria's shoulders. As the reigning monarch, only she could propose. On the 15th of October, 1839, she summoned Albert to her private sitting room and asked him to marry her. He accepted. Victoria recorded in her journal that she felt certain she would be happy with him. Their wedding took place on the 10th of February, 1840, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. Victoria wore white, a choice that was not yet conventional and would, through the sheer force of her influence, transform bridal fashion for generations. 10,000 people gathered along the processional route. The crowds roared. After years of watching a young queen navigate her throne largely alone, Britain seemed genuinely delighted. The marriage was, from the beginning, a negotiation. Albert was intelligent, methodical, and deeply committed to reforming the monarchy into something more purposeful. He found the court disorganized, the household finances chaotic, and his own role painfully undefined. Parliament had debated reducing his proposed annuity. He had not been made a peer. Some Britons regarded him with suspicion, not entirely willing to accept a German prince at the heart of their national life. Albert persisted. He reorganized the royal household, cutting wasteful expenditure, establishing clear lines of management. He became Victoria's private secretary in all but name, reading her dispatches, advising on policy, bringing intellectual discipline to a role that had often run on instinct and impulse alone. Slowly, painstakingly, he reshaped what the monarchy was for. What emerged was something Britain had never quite seen. A royal family that looked, in its essential contours, like a prosperous middle-class household. Children arrived in rapid succession, 9 of them between 1840 and 1857. The royal nursery became almost a character in public life. Portraits showed Victoria and Albert surrounded by their children in warmth and informality. At Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, the family Albert redesigned as a private retreat. The couple planted a kitchen garden where the older children learned to grow vegetables. This was the cult of royal domesticity, and it was a political achievement as much as a personal one. At a time when the memory of George IV's spectacular marital failure still lingered, and when Republican murmurs occasionally surfaced among the working poor, the image of a virtuous, devoted royal couple carried genuine stabilizing force. Even the violence directed at Victoria seemed, perversely, to strengthen public affection. Between 1840 and 1842, she survived 3 separate shooting attempts. The attackers were young, deranged, and largely ineffectual, but the episodes were terrifying. Each time, crowds responded with outpourings of relief and loyalty that bordered on the euphoric. Britain had decided, it seemed, that it loved its queen. The partnership at the center of all this was, by any account, a genuine love match. Victoria adored Albert with an intensity that sometimes alarmed even her closest attendants. Albert, more reserved in expression, was equally devoted. Together they had created something new, a monarchy rooted not in military glory or aristocratic grandeur, but in the quieter virtues of family, duty, and earnest purpose. Whether those virtues could hold firm through the turbulent decades ahead was a question that would take the rest of the century to answer. While Victoria and Albert arranged their kitchen garden at Osborne House, millions of their subjects were going hungry. Not metaphorically. Not as a figure of speech. Hungry in the most literal, devastating sense of the word. The 1840s would later earn a grim nickname, the Hungry Forties. And the name fit. Britain's industrial cities had grown with extraordinary speed and almost no planning whatsoever. Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, these places had swallowed hundreds of thousands of people from the countryside and offered them in return. Wages, yes, but also unventilated cellars, open sewers, 14-hour working days, and the constant company of cholera. Friedrich Engels, a young German industrialist's son who had come to Manchester to learn the family cotton business, walked through these streets and wrote down what he saw. His 1845 book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, was a document of sustained, meticulous outrage. Children working before dawn. Families of 6 sharing a single room without windows. Life expectancies in industrial districts falling below 30 years. Engels wrote it as an indictment. He was not wrong. Into this already brittle landscape came the Chartists. The movement had roots going back to 1838, but through the 1840s it became something formidable. The People's Charter demanded 6 reforms, among them universal male suffrage, the secret ballot, and the abolition of property requirements for members of Parliament. These seem modest enough to modern ears. At the time, they were considered revolutionary. Parliament rejected mass petitions in 1839, 1842, and 1848. The third rejection came with more than 5 million signatures attached. Members of Parliament were not moved. What the Chartists represented, however, was more than a list of demands. They represented a working population that had decided, with gathering anger, that the political system had been built for someone else entirely. Then came Ireland. In the autumn of 1845, a watermood called Phytophthora infestans arrived in Ireland and began destroying the potato crop. For a country where roughly 1/3 of the population depended almost entirely on that single crop for food, the consequences were beyond catastrophic. The blight returned in 1846, worse than before. And then again. By the time the famine had run its terrible course in 1852, approximately 1 million people had died of starvation and related disease. Another million had emigrated in those same years alone. What did Britain do? The question has haunted Anglo-Irish relations ever since. The answers are complicated, but they are not flattering. Prime Minister Robert Peel initially arranged imports of American maize. His successor, Lord John Russell, leaned more heavily on the principle that the market should correct itself, that government intervention would only breed dependency. Relief works were established, requiring starving people to break stones for roads in exchange for wages too low to buy adequate food. When soup kitchens were finally opened in 1847, they fed 3 million people daily at their peak. They were then closed again, deemed too expensive. Meanwhile, food continued to be exported from Ireland throughout the famine years, a fact that has never been forgotten. The political fallout reshaped British politics in ways that lasted decades. Peel, in one of the 19th century's great acts of political self-destruction, used the famine crisis to justify repealing the Corn Laws in 1846, removing the tariffs that had protected British grain prices and that had kept bread expensive for the poor. It was arguably the right policy. It also split the Conservative Party down the middle. Peel's own members voted against him. He resigned within weeks of the repeal passing. His party fractured into pieces that would take a generation to reassemble. And the Irish kept leaving. By 1850, emigration had become something closer to a hemorrhage. Ships crossed the Atlantic bearing people who carried with them a grief and a bitterness that would cross the ocean intact, and in the form of Irish-American political memory, would shape the relationship between Ireland and Britain for well over a century to come. The Hungry Forties had asked a fundamental question of industrial Britain. What did it owe its most vulnerable people? The decade closed without a satisfying answer. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain had done something no nation in human history had ever managed before. It had become the manufacturer of the world. The numbers alone strain comprehension. By 1850, Britain was producing more than half of the world's iron and coal. Its mills and foundries turned out more cloth, more steel, more machinery than all of its European rivals combined. When delegates from around the globe gathered in London's Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition of 1851, they came to marvel at a country that seemed to have seized the future with both hands. But what did that future look like from the inside? Visit Lancashire in the 1840s and the senses are immediately overwhelmed. The sky above Manchester and its surrounding mill towns sits the color of pewter, thickened with coal smoke from thousands of chimneys that never stop burning. The noise is relentless, a mechanical percussion of looms and steam engines that begins before dawn and continues until well after dark. Manchester had grown from a modest market town of under 25,000 people in 1772 to a roaring metropolis of over 300,000 by 1850. It was the undisputed global capital of cotton, its warehouses stacked with cloth destined for every continent on Earth. Yorkshire and the Midlands told similar stories. Leeds dominated woolen cloth. Birmingham and the Black Country produced iron goods, hardware, and weapons. Sheffield made cutlery and steel. The canal networks that had begun threading across England in the previous century now carried an astonishing volume of raw materials and finished goods, supplemented increasingly by the railways that were stitching the nation together at speed. Yet the human cost of all this production was recorded in devastating detail by parliamentary investigators who fanned out across the country and wrote down what they found. The 1842 Mines Report, commissioned under Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury, contained testimony that scandalized even a population accustomed to industrial hardship. Children as young as 5 years old worked underground in the coal mines, dragging heavy coal carts through tunnels too narrow for adults. Young girls, stripped to the waist in the heat, hauled loads on hands and knees for shifts of 12 hours or more. The report included illustrations. Parliament, for once, reacted with something approaching horror. The resulting Mines Act of 1842 prohibited women and boys under 10 from working underground. It was a start, though enforcement was patchy and the hours demanded of older workers remained punishing. The Factory Acts told a similar story of slow, grudging progress. The Act of 1833 had limited children under 9 from working in textile mills and required 2 hours of daily schooling for child workers. The 10 Hours Act of 1847 finally capped the working day for women and young persons in textile factories. Employers resisted, lobbied, and frequently found creative ways around the restrictions. The machinery of regulation was always running to catch up with the machinery of production. What strikes the modern observer most forcefully, perhaps, is not the cruelty of individual factory owners, but the sheer systemic normality of it all. Children in mines and mills were not an aberration. They were a design feature of an economy that had not yet been asked to consider whether a child's labor had any limit at all. Britain had built the workshop of the world. The question now pressing itself upon the Victorian conscience was a simple and uncomfortable one: at what cost and to whom? That question would find its sharpest expression not in the factories of Lancashire, but in the drawing rooms, lecture halls, and reform movements of a society beginning, haltingly, to reckon with what industrialization had actually made of it. It was, by any measure, the most ambitious building ever attempted in the history of construction. And it was designed by a gardener. Joseph Paxton had made his name coaxing exotic plants at Chatsworth, the Duke of Devonshire's great estate in Derbyshire. His genius lay in glass and iron, in the vast greenhouse structures he had perfected over decades of horticultural experiment. When the Royal Commission, chaired by Prince Albert himself, rejected over 240 conventional designs for a building to house the Great Exhibition, Paxton sketched his alternative in roughly 9 days. The result was a prefabricated palace of cast iron and plate glass covering almost 1 million square feet of Hyde Park, longer than 3 of today's aircraft carriers placed end to end. Workers assembled it in just 17 weeks. The building alone announced something about Britain. Stone and brick were the materials of the past. Glass and iron, replicable and modular and built at industrial speed, were the materials of the future. On the 1st of May, 1851, Queen Victoria arrived to open the exhibition before a crowd of some 25,000 invited guests. She later recorded that the sight of the structure, flooded with light, filled with the murmur of fountains and the gleam of crystal, moved her to tears. The elm trees of Hyde Park rose inside the nave, incorporated rather than felled, the living world folded into the industrial spectacle. The organ played. The choir sang. Foreign dignitaries in dress uniforms stood alongside manufacturers from the Midlands and cotton merchants from Manchester. For one morning, at least, Britain's self-image was perfectly realized in a single building. 6 million visitors followed over the next 5.5 months. That figure, in a country of roughly 20 million people, represents something extraordinary. The railways, whose expansion the previous decades had made possible, brought working people from every corner of England. Single-shilling admission days, introduced deliberately, put the exhibition within reach of factory workers and their families. Many saw London for the first time in their lives. What they came to see was nothing less than the material inventory of an empire. Over 100,000 exhibits filled the transepts and galleries. Raw cotton sat beside finished cloth. Indian silks and jewels, including the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond, gleamed in their cases. There were hydraulic presses, locomotive engines, model ships, agricultural tools, surgical instruments, and a device that allowed simultaneous printing on both sides of a newspaper. The exhibits came from 32 nations, but roughly half the floor space belonged to Britain and its colonies. The message was deliberate and unmistakable. Prince Albert had conceived the exhibition partly as a monument to free trade, the idea, championed by Britain's manufacturers and recently embodied in the repeal of the Corn Laws, that open markets would bind nations together in prosperous, peaceful exchange. Having industrialized first and furthest, had every reason to love free trade. It was already winning. Critics muttered. Some worried about crowds and disorder. Others questioned whether the working classes could be trusted with fine objects in enclosed spaces. The crowds were orderly. The objects survived. Even the sparrows that had nested in the Hyde Park elms, and whose droppings had caused considerable official anxiety, were eventually removed after the Duke of Wellington suggested the only solution was sparrowhawks. When the exhibition closed in October, it had generated a surplus of £186,000. Prince Albert directed those profits toward a permanent legacy. The land purchased south of Hyde Park in the years that followed became home to the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Science Museum, and the Royal Albert Hall. South Kensington became, in effect, a permanent monument to the proposition that knowledge, art, and industry belong together. The Crystal Palace itself was dismantled and relocated to Sydenham Hill in South London, where it would stand until fire consumed it in 1936. But in the summer of 1851, as visitors poured through its iron doors from across the empire and the world, Britain had offered its answer to the great question of the age. It had not merely built the workshop of the world. It had put that workshop on display, invited in the audience, and taken a bow. The question was whether the prosperity on show in Hyde Park was shared by all who. Before the first locomotive ever steamed into a London terminus, the journey from the capital to Edinburgh took roughly 42 hours by coach. By 1850, it took under 12. Nothing in human experience had prepared people for this compression of distance. Not the canal, not the turnpike road, not any innovation in the long centuries before. The railway did not merely move people faster. It reorganized the entire geometry of British life. The network had begun modestly enough. In 1838, roughly 1,000 miles of track crossed the country, connecting a handful of cities in rough, experimental lines. Then the builders got serious. By 1850, that figure had multiplied sixfold to nearly 6,000 miles, stitching together Manchester and Liverpool, Birmingham and Bristol, Edinburgh and London in a web of iron and steam that had no precedent anywhere on Earth. The man who captured the imagination of the age was Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Barely 5 feet tall, perpetually wreathed in cigar smoke, he approached engineering the way a composer approaches a symphony, with an insistence on total vision and a complete indifference to the opinion that something could not be done. His Great Western Railway, running from London to Bristol, demanded tunnels blasted through solid limestone at Box Hill, viaducts arching across the Vale of the White Horse, and a gauge broader than any other railway in Britain, which Brunel insisted would deliver a smoother, faster ride. He was right about the ride. He was eventually forced to convert the gauge anyway. Even genius must eventually negotiate with the network. The financial frenzy surrounding the railways became, for a decade, its own spectacle. Railway mania gripped Britain through the middle 1840s, as thousands of investors, from wealthy landowners to clerks and shopkeepers, poured savings into new railway companies with names suggesting permanence and profit. Parliament authorized over 9,000 miles of new lines in 1846 alone. The crash, when it came, wiped out fortunes and reputations alike. Yet, even the wreckage left behind something useful. the tracks remained. Among the stranger consequences of the railway was what it did to time. Before the trains, every town in Britain kept its own local time, calibrated to the sun. Bristol ran 10 minutes behind London. Newcastle differed from both. This charming variation became a logistical catastrophe once railway timetables required coordination across hundreds of miles. The solution was the adoption of Greenwich Mean Time across the entire network and eventually across the nation. By 1847, railway companies were synchronizing their clocks to a single standard. Britain had invented a new form of order, imposed not by parliament or monarch, but by the practical demands of the timetable. The social consequences spread further still. Cheap excursion fares, introduced in the 1840s and formalized by the Cheap Trains Act of 1844, placed long-distance travel within reach of working families for the first time. The seaside, once reserved for those who could afford a week away, became accessible to the mill worker on a day trip. Thomas Cook organized his first commercial excursion by rail in 1841. And then there were the suburbs. When a clerk could live 10 miles from his office and still arrive by 9 in the morning, the city began to dissolve outward. New neighborhoods bloomed along the lines radiating from London, Birmingham, and Manchester. The commuter was born, along with a new idea of domestic life, one in which work and home were no longer the same place but separate worlds, connected by a departing train and a return journey at dusk. The railways had not merely changed how Britain moved. They had changed what Britain was. And as the network continued expanding toward the 1870s, the revolution it carried was still gathering speed, feeding raw materials to factories, delivering finished goods to markets, and drawing the scattered islands of the British economy into something that functioned, for the first time, as a single whole. The railways had knitted Britain together just in time for Britain to go to war. In the autumn of 1853, a dispute over the rights of Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire ignited a conflict that would drag the great powers of Europe into the bloodiest fighting the continent had seen since Napoleon. Russia, expanding southward with relentless ambition, pressed its claims against a weakening Ottoman state. Britain and France, alarmed by Russian dominance over the Black Sea and the threat to Mediterranean trade routes, chose sides. In March of 1854, they declared war. It was a war entered with confidence and left with hard-won wisdom. The British army that sailed for the Crimean Peninsula was, in many ways, a relic. Its officer corps still purchased their commissions outright, meaning that wealth and social standing mattered more than talent or training. Men who had last seen action at Waterloo nearly 40 years earlier held senior commands. The consequences would prove catastrophic. On the 25th of October, 1854, at a valley outside the port of Balaclava, a miscommunication between senior commanders sent 670 British cavalrymen charging directly into the massed artillery of the Russian army. Lord Raglan, the British commander, had intended an order to prevent Russian forces from capturing abandoned guns on a nearby ridge. The order, relayed through an imperious and contemptuous cavalry commander named Lord Cardigan, was interpreted as a command to charge the heavily defended valley ahead. What followed lasted barely 20 minutes. When the survivors returned, barely half the brigade remained in the saddle. Alfred Lord Tennyson would immortalize the charge within weeks, writing of cannon to the right and cannon to the left, volleying and thundering. The poem made heroes of the dead. It could not disguise what the living knew. that the aristocratic system governing the British military had failed, visibly and grotesquely, before the watching world. That watching world was something genuinely new. William Howard Russell, reporting for the Times of London, became the first modern war correspondent, sending back dispatches that reached British breakfast tables within days. His descriptions of soldiers dying from cholera in filthy, undersupplied hospitals, of officers incompetent and indifferent, of wounded men left to rot in the mud outside Sevastopol, ignited a public fury that governments could not ignore. The Crimea was the first media war. It would not be the last. Into that fury stepped Florence Nightingale. Arriving at the military hospital at Scutari in November of 1854 with 38 nurses, she found conditions of almost unimaginable squalor. Wards were overcrowded, sewers blocked, medical supplies absent, and mortality rates running above 40%. Within months of her systematic reforms, proper sanitation, organized nursing care, and the revolutionary idea that cleanliness saved lives, the death rate had fallen to under 2%. She returned to England in 1856, a national icon. Her subsequent work in statistical analysis and hospital design reshaped medicine for generations. The fortress city of Sevastopol finally fell in September of 1855, after a siege lasting nearly a year. The Treaty of Paris, signed in March of 1856, ended the war with Russia checked and Ottoman territory preserved. Britain had achieved its strategic objectives. But the cost had run deeper than the casualty figures. The Crimea forced a reckoning with the structures that Victorian confidence had left unexamined. If the railways had demonstrated what modern organization could achieve, the Crimea had demonstrated what the absence of it looked like. The pressure for reform in the army and beyond would build steadily through the years ahead, as Britain turned its attention from foreign battlefields to the turbulent politics of its own expanding empire. The ink on the Treaty of Paris had barely dried when the next crisis arrived, not from the steppes of Russia, but from the plains of northern India. And it would shake the British Empire to its foundations. By the spring of 1857, the tensions running through British India had reached a breaking point years in the making. The East India Company, that extraordinary commercial enterprise that had somehow become the ruler of a subcontinent, had spent decades accumulating grievances. Princely states were annexed under the so-called Doctrine of Lapsi, stripping local rulers of their thrones whenever the company judged their heirs insufficiently legitimate. Traditional customs were dismissed, local power structures dismantled, and ancient dignities treated as obstacles to modern administration. Then came the cartridges. The new Enfield rifle issued to the company's Indian sepoy soldiers required its paper cartridges to be bitten open before loading. Rumor spread rapidly through the ranks that the cartridges were greased with a mixture of cow and pig fat, an offense of staggering religious significance to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. Whether the rumors were accurate mattered less than the fact that millions believed them. The cartridges became the spark dropped into a room full of gunpowder. On the 10th of May, 1857, sepoys at Meerut refused their orders, shot their officers, and marched on Delhi. Within days, the rebellion had swept across a vast arc of northern India. The last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah II, an elderly poet more than a warrior, found himself proclaimed leader of a revolt he had not sought. The British grip on India suddenly seemed desperately fragile. What followed was 9 months of savagery that neither side would forget. At Cawnpore, A British garrison surrendered under a promise of safe passage. Instead, somewhere around 200 British women and children were massacred, their bodies thrown into a well. The horror traveled back to Britain in newspaper dispatches and inflamed public opinion to a fever pitch. At Lucknow, a British residency held out under siege for 5 months, its defenders slowly dying, awaiting relief columns that seemed forever delayed. At Delhi, British and loyal Indian forces besieged the city through a scorching summer before storming it in September of 1857. The British reprisals were ferocious. Sepoys were executed en masse, many by the deliberately humiliating method of being strapped across cannon mouths before the guns were fired. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned. Bahadur Shah II was captured, tried, and exiled to Rangoon, where he died in 1862. With him died the last embers of the Mughal dynasty, the ruling house that had governed much of India since 1526. A civilization 3 centuries old was extinguished in an afternoon. When the British government surveyed the wreckage, one conclusion was inescapable. The East India Company, that peculiar hybrid of commerce and conquest, could no longer be trusted with the management of 150 million people. On the 2nd of August, 1858, Parliament passed the Government of India Act. The company was dissolved. India passed directly under the authority of the British Crown, governed henceforth by a Secretary of State in London and a Viceroy on the ground in Calcutta. The British Raj had been born. Queen Victoria would eventually be proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, the jewel in the crown of an empire that would one day cover a quarter of the Earth's surface. But the relationship established in 1858 rested on a foundation forever altered by the violence of 1857. Trust between ruler and ruled had been broken in ways that administrative reform could not fully repair. Back in Britain, the absorption of India's direct governance demanded something that the Crimea had already begun to teach: that running an empire required competence, organization, and accountability, not merely confidence and commercial appetite. The lessons were accumulating, and at home, in the factories and cities of industrial Britain, a society transforming itself at breathtaking speed was asking its own urgent questions about who held power and why. He had been the architect of modern Britain in ways few fully appreciated while he lived. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, 42 years old, methodical and brilliant and perpetually exhausted, took to his bed at Windsor Castle in late November of 1861. His doctors spoke of a stomach ailment, perhaps typhoid fever contracted from the notoriously inadequate drains beneath the castle. Victoria, watching from the doorway, sensed something worse. On the 14th of December, 1861, at 10 minutes to 11 in the evening, Albert died. The Queen pressed her lips to his face and called his name into silence. What followed was not ordinary grief. It was a total eclipse. Victoria was 42 years old and would live for another 39 years, virtually every one of them spent in the shadow of that December night. She ordered Albert's clothes laid out fresh each morning as though he might dress. She slept beside a cast of his hand. His shaving water was brought to his room daily. The public understood mourning. What they struggled to understand was its permanence. Victorian Britain had already developed an elaborate grammar of loss. Black crepe fabric sold in quantities that mill owners could scarcely supply. Jet jewelry from the cliffs of Whitby became fashionable, than essential. Mourning periods were precisely calibrated by social class and relationship. A widow expected to wear full black for 2 years, then half-mourning grays and mauves before color returned. Photographers offered post-mortem portraits, a final image of the departed before burial. Spiritualists and mediums held seances in fashionable drawing rooms, and Victoria herself, according to persistent rumors, was not entirely beyond their reach. But there was a political cost that no amount of black creep could conceal. The Queen retreated from public life with a totality that began to frighten her ministers. She refused to open Parliament. She declined public appearances for months that stretched into years. By the mid-1860s, pamphlets were circulating in London with titles that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. "What does she do with it?" asked one, referring pointedly to the civil list, the parliamentary allowance that funded the royal household. A Republican murmur, still quiet but unmistakably present, moved through the streets. The political vacuum she left behind was filled, inevitably, by strong men. Her prime ministers discovered that governing Britain increasingly meant governing without active royal participation. Lord Palmerston, that irrepressible old diplomat who had seemed a permanent fixture of British public life, died in office in October of 1865, just 2 days short of his 81st birthday. He was replaced by Lord Russell, then by others in a succession that illustrated a shifting truth. The monarchy, which under Albert had been a genuine engine of policy, was becoming something different, more symbolic, less operational. This transformation would have consequences stretching far beyond Victoria's own lifetime. The powerful prime ministers who filled the vacuum of the 1860s were learning to govern independently, and the parliamentary machinery they strengthened would eventually become something no individual monarch could reverse. The cult of Albert was real and sincere, but it could not hold the country still. Britain in 1866 was a nation of over 29 million people, its cities swelling, its factories thundering, its working population asking questions about representation and rights that the grief of one widow could not indefinitely delay. A reform movement was gathering in the streets, and in the corridors of Westminster, ambitious men were already calculating how to harness it. The Queen mourned. Britain moved. 2 years before Albert's death, a quiet, meticulous man in the Kent countryside had already lit the fuse. Charles Darwin had spent 20 years gathering evidence, testing arguments, dreading the reaction he knew was coming. On the 24th of November, 1859, he finally published On the Origin of Species. The entire first printing of 1,200 copies sold out the same day. The idea at its heart was deceptively simple. Species were not fixed creations placed on Earth by divine design. They changed over time, shaped by natural selection, the relentless pressure of environment and competition. Those best suited to their conditions survived. Those that did not vanished. The process required no designer. It required only time, vast quantities of it, stretching back hundreds of millions of years. That last point was itself explosive. Geologists like Charles Lyell had already been quietly undermining the biblical timeline of creation, their rock strata telling a story of unimaginable age. Physicists were calculating the age of the sun, the cooling of the earth. The universe, it was becoming clear, was incomparably older than Genesis suggested. Darwin's theory arrived not as a single shock, but as the final blow in a long accumulation of scientific evidence that had been eroding orthodox certainty for decades. The confrontation could not be avoided. On the 30th of June, 1860, in a crowded lecture hall at Oxford, it arrived in spectacular form. Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, polished and confident, rose to demolish Darwin's theory before an audience of hundreds. He turned to Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's fierce champion and self-styled bulldog, and asked, with elaborate sarcasm, whether Huxley was descended from an ape on his grandfather's side or his grandmother's side. Huxley, according to witnesses, quietly murmured that the Lord had delivered his enemy into his hands. He replied that he would rather be descended from an ape than from a man who used his considerable gifts to obscure scientific truth. The room erupted. A woman reportedly fainted. The battle between science and religion had found its defining moment. For educated Victorians, the stakes were intensely personal. Faith was not merely a Sunday habit. It was the structure through which suffering made sense. Death was bearable, morality was grounded. A world without divine design was a world suddenly stripped of its scaffolding. Matthew Arnold captured the feeling precisely in his poem Dover Beach, listening to the retreating tide of faith and finding only darkness where certainty had been. The philosopher Thomas Henry Huxley coined a new word for this uncomfortable middle ground: agnosticism. One need not deny God. One simply could not know. Not everyone retreated into uncertainty. Some twisted Darwin's findings into something he never intended. Herbert Spencer coined the phrase survival of the fittest and applied it not to species across geological time, but to contemporary human societies. The poor were poor because they were less fit. Charity was interference with natural law. This so-called social Darwinism offered the comfortable classes a scientific vocabulary for their indifference, and it spread with disturbing ease through the drawing rooms and policy chambers of late Victorian Britain. Darwin himself, careful and humane, was appalled by such applications. In 1871, he published The Descent of Man, extending his argument explicitly to human beings and emphasizing the role of cooperation and moral instinct in human evolution. It added another tremor to the ongoing earthquake. By the early 1870s, Victorian intellectual life had been permanently rearranged. Science had claimed new authority. Faith had been forced onto the defensive. And in the streets beyond the debating halls, a different kind of upheaval was already underway. While Darwin's ideas shook Victorian minds, another battle was reshaping Victorian politics, and it was fought with speeches, votes, and the sharpest wit in Parliament. Two men came to dominate British public life in this era so completely that their rivalry seemed less like a political contest and more like a force of nature. William Ewart Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli were opposites in almost every conceivable way. Gladstone, the son of a Liverpool merchant, approached politics as a form of moral duty, driven by conscience, scripture, and an almost exhausting earnestness. Disraeli, the baptized son of a Jewish writer, was flamboyant, cynical, and endlessly entertaining, a novelist who had talked his way into the highest offices in the land. Queen Victoria adored Disraeli and could barely tolerate Gladstone, who she complained addressed her like a public meeting. Their rivalry produced results. Disraeli moved first. In 1867, his conservative government passed the Second Reform Act, a bold and calculated gamble that nearly doubled the electorate overnight. Working-class men in urban boroughs finally received the vote. Roughly 1 million new voters entered the rolls. Disraeli called it a leap in the dark, and he was not wrong. Nobody knew exactly what a larger democracy would demand. Gladstone provided an answer. His first ministry, beginning in 1868, delivered a torrent of legislation that remade British institutions. The Irish Church Act of 1869 disestablished the Anglican Church in Ireland, severing its link to a state whose people were overwhelmingly Catholic. The Education Act of 1870 created a national framework of elementary schools for the first time, filling the enormous gaps that voluntary institutions had failed to cover. 2 years later, the secret ballot replaced open voting, ending the culture of intimidation and bribery that had made elections into spectacles of coercion. Disraeli returned to power in 1874 and demonstrated that conservatives could also govern for the common people. His ministry passed the Public Health Act of 1875, creating the foundations of modern sanitation infrastructure across British towns. The Artisans' Dwellings Act tackled the festering slum conditions that had long shamed industrial cities. Factory legislation strengthened protections for workers. Disraeli called his approach one-nation conservatism, the idea that a healthy society depended on the well-being of all its classes, not merely the privileged few. The phrase would outlast him by more than a century. Back came Gladstone, and with him a new moral crusade. His Midlothian campaign of 1879 and 80 was something genuinely new in British politics, a leader traveling the country, addressing thousands directly, making the case for his vision in speech after impassioned speech. Crowds turned out in extraordinary numbers. Politics had become a form of mass participation. The final great reform of this era came in 1884. Gladstone's Third Reform Act extended the vote to rural workers for the first time, bringing agricultural laborers and miners in county seats into the political nation. The electorate expanded by roughly 5 million people. Britain was not yet a full democracy. Women remained entirely excluded, but the arc of the century was unmistakable. By the time both men had aged and exhausted themselves in service and combat, they had between them transformed what British government was capable of doing and who it was supposed to serve. The state had become larger, more active, more present in ordinary lives than anything their predecessors would have recognized. But the greatest test of Gladstone's career still lay ahead, and it centered on a question that had haunted British politics for decades. What was to be done about Ireland? By the middle of the 19th century, London was choking on its own success. A city of 2.5 million people had no coherent system for dealing with the consequences of 2.5 million bodies. Waste ran through open ditches into the Thames. The Thames fed the drinking water pumps. And every summer, the cycle of contamination turned deadly. Cholera had already struck Britain 4 times since 1831, each wave killing tens of thousands. Most physicians blamed miasma, the theory that disease floated through foul-smelling air. It was a reasonable guess, given the stench. It was also wrong. In the summer of 1854, a Soho physician named John Snow made one of the most consequential observations in medical history. When cholera tore through the neighborhood around Broad Street, Snow did not look at the air. He looked at a map. Plotting every death against its location, he noticed something unmistakable. The cases clustered tightly around a single water pump. Snow petitioned the local authorities to remove the pump handle. They complied reluctantly. The outbreak collapsed almost immediately. Snow's discovery that cholera traveled through contaminated water rather than through air was revolutionary, though it took years for the medical establishment to fully accept it. The implications were vast. If water carried death, then the water supply had to be controlled, cleaned, and separated absolutely from sewage. London received the message in the most visceral way possible in the summer of 1858. A prolonged drought concentrated decades of accumulated waste in the Thames until the smell became so overpowering that Parliament itself had to drape its curtains in chloride of lime just to continue sitting. Members fled committee rooms gasping. The newspapers called it the Great Stink. It was, in its own grotesque way, the smell of political change. Parliament responded with unusual speed. Within weeks, it authorized an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette to build what the city desperately needed. What Bazalgette designed and built over the following decade was a masterpiece of Victorian ambition. More than 80 miles of main sewers intercepting the old drainage channels before they reached the river, carrying waste eastward to treatment works beyond the populated city. Over 1,000 miles of street sewers feeding into the system. The project required the laying of 318 million bricks. When it was complete, it had transformed the basic sanitary conditions of the largest city on Earth. Deaths from cholera in London plummeted. The disease that had killed tens of thousands returned only in vastly reduced form. The broader transformation of Victorian cities required more than sewers. It required law. The Public Health Acts, particularly the sweeping legislation of 1875, gave local authorities the power and the obligation to regulate water, drainage, housing, and food supplies. Boards of health multiplied across British towns. The state was reaching into everyday life in ways that would have seemed extraordinary to earlier generations. Housing was the other front. Industrial cities had filled with slums so overcrowded that disease was almost unavoidable. Philanthropists moved where the market had failed. George Peabody, an American banker based in London, endowed model housing blocks for working families that still stand across the city today. Industrialists like the Cadbury family built entire model villages around their factories, providing workers with decent homes, parks, and clean air. By the 1870s, the Victorian city was still imperfect, still marked by poverty and inequality, but it was no longer quite the killing machine it had been. The expectation had shifted. Cities were now understood to owe their inhabitants something: clean water, functioning drains, habitable housing. The question of what the state owed its citizens was one that Irish affairs would press even more urgently in the years ahead. While Joseph Bazalgette was laying his final bricks beneath London's streets, British statesmen were drawing very different lines on very different maps. By the 1870s, the British Empire covered roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed, in one form or another, a quarter of its people. The sun, as the popular boast had it, never set on British territory. Somewhere, always, a Union Jack caught the light. The ideological machinery that justified this vast dominion ran on three fuels. Commerce came first, the argument that trade brought prosperity to all parties involved. Christianity followed, the sincere conviction held by many missionaries and administrators that British rule delivered souls from darkness. And beneath both ran something uglier, a belief, hardened into pseudo-scientific certainty by the later decades of the century, that the peoples of Asia and Africa occupied lower rungs of a racial hierarchy, and that their subordination was therefore natural, even beneficial. This was the so-called civilizing mission, and it allowed the British to confiscate, exploit, and kill while believing themselves philanthropists. Benjamin Disraeli understood the emotional power of empire better than almost anyone. In 1876, at his urging, Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. The ceremony was calculated theater, designed to bind Indian princes to the crown through spectacle and flattery. For Victoria, it was a title she cherished. For the millions of Indians living under company rule and then crown administration, it marked not liberation but the formalization of their subjection. The human cost was measured most starkly in famine. Between 1876 and 1879, and again between 1896 and 1900, drought and crop failure swept across southern and central India. The death toll from these famines reached into the millions, some estimates placing it as high as 29 million dead across the final decades of the century. What made these catastrophes especially damning was not the drought itself, but the response. Colonial administrators, wedded to free market orthodoxy, continued exporting grain from India even as people starved. Relief efforts were deliberately limited, partly from ideology and partly from a callous accounting that valued economic principle over Indian lives. In Africa, the process of dispossession moved with still more deliberate speed. European powers had long maintained coastal trading posts, but the interior remained largely beyond their grasp until the 1870s and 80s. Then, with breathtaking speed, the continent was divided. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, representatives of 14 European nations sat around a table and drew borders across a map of a continent most of them had never visited. African rulers were neither present nor consulted. Within 15 years, 90% of Africa was under European control. Britain's share was enormous, and no figure embodied its acquisition more completely than Cecil Rhodes. A sickly clergyman's son who had traveled to South Africa for his health, Rhodes became fabulously wealthy through diamond and gold mining, founded the British South Africa Company in 1889, and used it as a private instrument of imperial expansion. He dreamed openly of a British corridor of territory stretching from Cape Town to Cairo. The lands that became Rhodesia, today's Zimbabwe and Zambia, were seized through a combination of fraudulent treaties and armed force. Indigenous populations were stripped of cattle and land, then compelled through taxation to provide labor for the mines that enriched Rhodes and his shareholders. The pattern repeated across the continent. Dispossession, forced labor, punitive taxation, and systematic violence were not aberrations in the imperial project. They were its mechanisms. Back in Britain, however, most people encountered empire as a source of pride, pageantry, and cheap commodities. Tea from Ceylon, cotton from India, gold from South Africa. The costs were paid elsewhere, by people whose names rarely appeared in British newspapers. That distance between the metropolis and the human consequences of its empire would eventually close, as the wars empire generated began finding their way back to British shores. The age of confident expansion was approaching a reckoning that would begin in the South African veldt before the century was out. Behind the lace curtains, the gas-lit parlors, and the Sunday sermons, Victorian Britain nursed a collection of secrets that its public morality worked hard to conceal. The respectable surface and the hidden reality were not separate worlds. They were the same world, seen from different angles. The Newport Law of 1834 was presented as reform. What it delivered was punishment, Under the old parish system, the poor had received relief in their own homes. The new system demanded something different. If you wanted help, you entered the workhouse. And inside, the principle of less eligibility ensured that conditions would be worse than the lowest independent laborer could endure. Families were separated on arrival, husbands from wives, children from parents, the logic being that comfort might encourage dependency. Inmates wore uniforms, ate in silence, and performed grinding, pointless labor, breaking stones or unpicking old rope until their fingers bled. Charles Dickens immortalized the system's cruelty in Oliver Twist, but for millions of real people, the workhouse was not fiction. It was the specific terror that haunted every working-class life. The same decade saw a dramatic expansion of lunatic asylums. By the 1870s, Britain housed tens of thousands of patients in vast institutional complexes. Some were genuinely ill. Others were inconvenient. Women who defied their husbands, men who drank too freely, individuals whose sexual or social behavior embarrassed their families could find themselves certified and committed with troubling ease. The medical profession, newly ambitious, had claimed madness as its territory. The asylum became a warehouse for nonconformity dressed in clinical language. Victorian sexual hypocrisy operated on an even grander scale. The age that produced prudish drawing room etiquette also sustained an enormous commercial sex trade. By some estimates, London alone in the 1850s contained 80,000 prostitutes. Poverty drove most of them to it. The Contagious Diseases Acts of 1864, 66, and 69 responded not by addressing that poverty but by subjecting women in garrison towns to compulsory medical inspection for venereal disease. Men faced no equivalent examination. The law treated prostitution as a female pathology. Josephine Butler found this so monstrous that she built a national campaign against it, arguing with remarkable clarity that the acts regulated the abuse of women rather than protecting them. Parliament eventually repealed the acts in 1886, a genuine victory won by a genuinely courageous woman. Then came 1888. 5 women, all living in the desperate poverty of Whitechapel, were murdered in the autumn of that year. The killer called himself Jack the Ripper. He was never identified. But his crimes did something unexpected. They dragged journalists and social investigators into the East End, and what they found there horrified a nation that had preferred not to look. Families living 6 to a single room. Children working before they could read. Life expectancy decades below that of wealthy Londoners living a mile away. The Ripper murders became an accidental exposure of structural violence that had been operating quietly for generations. The criminal justice system completed the picture. Transportation to Australia had removed over 160,000 convicts from British streets before the practice ended in the 1860s. Public hangings drew carnival crowds until 1868, when executions moved inside prison walls, removing the spectacle without removing the punishment. Prison reformers like Elizabeth Fry had argued for rehabilitation over mere suffering, and some reforms followed. But the fundamental logic of Victorian justice, that poverty and crime were moral failures requiring severe correction, proved stubbornly resistant to change. These were the hidden costs of respectability, paid most heavily by those the century preferred not to see. And as the Victorian era entered its final decade, the pressure of those hidden costs was beginning to build towards something new. While Victorian Britain wrestled with its social conscience, something equally transformative was happening in its laboratories, factories, and telegraph offices. The late Victorian decades crackled with invention. The world was being rewired quite literally before people's eyes. The moment that announced this new age arrived on July 27, 1866, when the steamship Great Eastern finally laid a working transatlantic telegraph cable across the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Previous attempts had failed, snapping under the ocean's pressure. This one held. Within hours, a message could travel from London to New York in minutes rather than weeks. Queen Victoria exchanged pleasantries with President Andrew Johnson across 3,000 miles of deep water. Merchants, diplomats, and journalists grasped immediately what this meant. Distance, the ancient enemy of human communication, had been defeated. The telegraph was only the beginning. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell transmitted the human voice along a wire for the first time. The telephone arrived in British cities within years. Then came something even stranger. Thomas Edison's phonograph of 1877 captured sound itself, freezing a moment of music or speech onto a rotating cylinder. For the first time in human history, the dead could speak. A voice, once uttered, need not disappear forever. Light itself was being conquered in the same years. Joseph Swan, working in Newcastle, demonstrated a practical incandescent light bulb in 1879, a few months before Edison reached the same solution in America. Rather than fight, the two men eventually merged their interests. By 1882, London's Holborn Viaduct became one of the first streets in the world lit by electric light, its warm glow replacing the flickering uncertainty of gas lamps. The darkness that had defined human nights for all of recorded history was beginning to retreat. Photography, meanwhile, was transforming how people understood reality itself. George Eastman's introduction of roll film in 1888 put cameras into ordinary hands for the first time. Science used photographs to capture what the eye could not follow. Journalism used them to make distant suffering impossible to dismiss. And ordinary families used them to preserve faces that would otherwise fade from memory entirely. On the roads, a quieter revolution was gathering speed. The bicycle craze of the 1880s and 90s gave working people genuine mobility for the first time, and women found in cycling a practical argument against restrictive clothing and restricted lives. Then, in 1888, Carl Benz demonstrated a horseless carriage powered by an internal combustion engine. By the time Victoria died in 1901, a handful of automobiles were already clattering through British streets, terrifying horses and hinting at a transportation future that would reshape every city on Earth. The Victorians had begun their era traveling at the speed of a horse. They ended it standing on the threshold of the automobile age, speaking to each other across oceans and photographing the world as it actually was. What did it mean to be a woman in Victorian Britain? In law, the answer was brutal in its simplicity. Upon marriage, a woman ceased to exist as a legal person. Her property became her husband's. Her earnings belonged to him. Her children were his. She could not vote, could not attend university, could not practice medicine or law. She was, in the eyes of the state, a dependent. For most of the century, this was simply the order of things. But across the Victorian decades, quietly at first and then with gathering force, women began to push back. The first cracks appeared in property law. Before 1870, any money a woman earned or inherited vanished legally into her husband's hands the moment she married. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 changed this, allowing women to keep their own wages and modest inheritances. It was a partial measure, hedged with limitations. But 12 years later, the Act of 1882 went further, granting married women full legal ownership of all property they brought into or acquired during marriage. For the first time, a wife was, in this limited but meaningful sense, a person. Education proved another battleground. In 1869, Emily Davies opened Girton College outside Cambridge, the first residential college for women in Britain. The women who studied there sat the same examinations as male students, often outperforming them. Yet Cambridge refused to award them degrees. They could do the work. They could not receive the recognition. Oxford's women's colleges followed in the 1870s. Full degrees from Cambridge would not come until 1948, a weight that spoke volumes about the depth of institutional resistance. Medicine presented its own walls. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson spent years fighting a system designed to exclude her. Rejected by every medical school in Britain, she found a legal loophole through the Society of Apothecaries and qualified in 1865, becoming England's first licensed female physician. The society promptly changed its rules to prevent other women from following her path. Garrett Anderson eventually helped found the London School of Medicine for Women in 1874, forcing open the door she had squeezed through alone. Alongside these practical campaigns, a political movement was taking shape. John Stuart Mill had presented a petition for women's suffrage to Parliament as early as 1866. By the 1880s, Millicent Fawcett was leading the constitutional suffrage movement with disciplined patience, building networks across the country, lobbying MPs, and insisting that the vote could be won through argument and persistence rather than confrontation. Her organization would eventually become the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Results remained frustratingly distant, but the foundations were being laid. By the 1890s, something had visibly shifted in culture. The new woman appeared in novels, in newspapers, and on the streets, cycling through parks in rational dress, pursuing careers, choosing independence over marriage. She scandalized traditionalists and delighted reformers in equal measure. The bicycle, already noted as a technological marvel of the age, became a symbol of female freedom, practical and defiant all at once. The changes won before 1900 were real but incomplete. Women could own property, train as doctors, and attend university lectures. They could not yet vote. The full story of suffrage would belong to the next century. But Victorian women had transformed the terms of the argument entirely. The question was no longer whether women deserved equal standing in public life. The question was only when. That unfinished business would collide, in the years ahead, with an empire at the height of its power and a society about to face the pressures that power concealed. If women occupied a contested place in Victorian society, children occupied something even more precarious. For the poor, childhood as a protected, innocent stage of life simply did not exist. A child who could walk could work. A child who could work was expected to. The mines made this visible in the most brutal possible terms. Before 1842, children as young as 5 descended into the darkness of Britain's coal pits, crawling through passages too narrow for adults, working shifts of 12 hours or more. The Mines Act of that year, driven by the reformer Lord Ashley, banned children under 10 from working underground and prohibited women and girls entirely. It was the first time the state had intervened to protect children in the workplace. It would not be the last. Factories remained largely unreformed. The streets of every major city were thick with children selling matches, sweeping crossings, begging. Charles Dickens had given the nation Oliver Twist in 1837. But fiction, however vivid, changed less than reformers hoped. What was needed were institutions. The Ragged Schools movement took root in the poorest districts, offering free, basic education to children who owned no shoes, let alone books. By the 1850s, hundreds of these improvised classrooms operated across Britain. They could not reach everyone. The Education Act of 1870 established a national network of board schools, and by 1880, attendance was compulsory for children up to 10 years old. For the first time, the state had claimed children's minds as a public responsibility. Thomas Barnardo arrived in London in 1866 intending to study medicine and encountered instead the scale of child destitution in the East End. He opened his first home for homeless boys in 1870. The organization he built would eventually rescue over 60,000 children during his lifetime alone, placing them in foster homes, training them in trades, and shipping thousands to new lives in Canada and Australia. Barnardo's methods were not without controversy, but his energy was extraordinary, and his homes became proof that systematic rescue was possible. Barnardo's work helped build public support for something more formal. The National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was founded in 1884, and 5 years later Parliament passed the Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act. For the first time, the state could intervene in cases of abuse within the family home. The private sphere had, in this narrow but significant way, been opened. Alongside all this ran a quieter revolution. The late Victorian decades produced Lewis Carroll's Alice, Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Islands, illustrated toy catalogs, and purpose-built nurseries. The idea that childhood deserved its own protected world of imagination and play was becoming an expectation among the middle classes. Two very different childhoods existed in Victorian Britain until the end. What the century bequeathed was the slow, contested recognition that both deserved better. That recognition would shape everything the Edwardian years attempted to build. Ireland never left the room. Through every debate on factory reform, every argument over the franchise, every imperial adventure in Africa or India, the Irish question sat at the table, demanding an answer that Victorian Britain could never quite bring itself to give. The Great Famine had ended a decade before our period opens, but its shadow stretched forward without mercy. Between 1845 and 1852, roughly 1 million people had died of starvation and disease while another million fled to America. The British government's response, shaped by dogma about free markets and moral improvement, had been catastrophically inadequate. Irish nationalists did not forget. They were not inclined to forgive. Out of this grief and fury grew the Fenian Brotherhood, founded in 1858 simultaneously in Ireland and among the vast Irish diaspora in America. The Fenians wanted complete independence, and they were prepared to take it by force. In 1867, they launched a rising in Ireland that collapsed almost immediately. But their campaign on British soil proved harder to suppress. Through the 1880s, Fenian dynamiters struck at London Bridge, the Houses of Parliament, Victoria Station, and even Scotland Yard. The explosions killed few but terrified many. Britain had brought the consequences of its Irish policy home to its own streets. Yet violence was not the only language of Irish resistance. Charles Stewart Parnell offered something more formidable still: discipline, parliamentary genius, and mass organization. Leading the Irish Parliamentary Party from the late 1870s, Parnell forged his members into a bloc that could obstruct, delay, and ultimately pressure any government that needed Irish votes. He paired this with the land war at home, where tenant farmers organized against rack-renting landlords under the Land League. The campaign gave the English language a new word. When a County Mayo land agent named Captain Charles Boycott refused to lower rents in 1880, his tenants simply refused to deal with him at all. His name entered the dictionary. Successive land acts gradually transferred ownership from the Anglo-Irish landlord class to the tenants themselves. It was the quiet dismantling of a centuries-old colonial settlement, achieved not through revolution but through relentless agitation and legislative grinding. The larger prize was home rule. Gladstone, now in his late 70s and still possessed of volcanic energy, introduced his first Home Rule Bill in 1886. It proposed an Irish Parliament in Dublin handling domestic affairs. The bill split his Liberal Party down the middle. 93 Liberals voted against their own leader. The bill fell. Gladstone tried again in 1893. The Lords crushed it with contemptuous ease. Ireland remained ungoverned, unreconciled, and unresolved. The question had consumed 2 decades of political energy and broken careers, parties, and promises. It would wait, gathering force beneath the surface of Edwardian calm, for a reckoning far more violent than Victorian Britain had imagined possible. While politicians fought over Ireland and reformers argued over factories, something equally consequential was happening in the parlors, studios, and garrets of Victorian Britain. A civilization was inventing its own conscience, and it chose to speak through art. Charles Dickens understood, before almost anyone else, that the novel could do more than entertain. It could indict. From the workhouses of Oliver Twist to the fog-choked courts of Bleak House, he pressed the faces of his comfortable readers against the glass and made them look at what lay on the other side. His serialized novels reached hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, building outrage chapter by chapter, installment by installment. He made Little Nell weep and made Scrooge repent, and in doing so he made a culture feel its own contradictions. Yet the Victorian literary imagination belonged equally to women who wrote under impossible conditions and often under assumed names. Charlotte and Emily Bronte published Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights in 1847 under the names Currer and Ellis Bell, knowing a woman's name on the cover invited condescension rather than criticism. Mary Ann Evans went further still, becoming George Eliot, and produced in Middlemarch perhaps the finest English novel of the entire century. A book about a woman of vast intelligence and ambition trapped by the narrow possibilities society offered her. One wonders if the autobiography was entirely accidental. Poetry wrestled with something darker. Alfred Lord Tennyson, appointed Poet Laureate in 1850, gave voice to the century's deepest anxiety in In Memoriam, a 17-year elegy for his dead friend Arthur Hallam that became, unexpectedly, a meditation on evolution, faith, and cosmic indifference. Robert Browning answered with psychological intensity, his dramatic monologues placing the reader uncomfortably inside murderers and obsessives. These were poets who felt the ground shifting beneath received religion and dared to say so aloud. Against the grinding ugliness of industrial cities, a group of young painters declared war. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, formed in 1848 by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais, and William Holman Hunt, rejected the gray conventions of academic painting and turned instead to luminous color, medieval romance, and the faces of women who looked as though they actually existed. Their canvases burned with an intensity that critics initially despised and the public eventually adored. The movement's spiritual heir was Oscar Wilde, who arrived in the 1880s preaching that art existed for its own sake and that beauty was its own justification. His plays filled theaters. His wit became legend. Then in 1895, prosecuted for gross indecency after a disastrous libel action against the Marquess of Queensberry, he was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. The trial that destroyed him also revealed everything Victorian culture preferred to keep hidden about itself. The Victorians built an empire with iron and steam. They built a culture with ink, paint, and the courage, sometimes, to tell the truth. That culture would outlast everything else they made. By the final year of the 19th century, the British Empire covered roughly 1/4 of the Earth's surface. Its maps were painted red from Canada to India, from West Africa to the Australian continent. It seemed, to those who administered it, almost beyond challenge. Then came South Africa. The trouble had been building for years. In 1886, the discovery of the world's largest gold deposits in the Transvaal region transformed a quiet pastoral republic of Dutch-descended Boer farmers into one of the most coveted territories on Earth. Cecil Rhodes, the diamond magnate and architect of British expansion in Africa, could barely contain himself. Neither could the colonial secretary Joseph Chamberlain. Between the gold fields and the diamond mines of Kimberley, a fortune beyond calculation sat inside territory that London did not control. That, to the imperial mind of the 1890s, was a problem demanding a solution. When negotiations with the Boer republics collapsed, Britain expected a short, punishing war. A matter of weeks, perhaps months. The Boers were farmers, after all. Stubborn, sun-hardened, deeply religious farmers who had lived on this land for generations and had absolutely no intention of surrendering it. The British Army learned this lesson at tremendous cost. In a single catastrophic week in December of 1899, remembered ever after as Black Week, British forces suffered 3 separate defeats at Stormberg, Magersfontein, and Colenso. Nearly 3,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in 7 days. The nation was stunned. General Redvers Buller, whose confidence had bordered on contempt for the enemy, was replaced. Lord Roberts and Kitchener were dispatched. The weeks stretched into months. The months into years. Even as British reinforcements poured in and the major Boer towns fell, the war refused to end. Boer commandos melted into the vast open veldt, staging guerrilla raids that tied down an army of nearly 500,000 men. Kitchener's response was methodical and merciless. He burned farmsteads to deny the commandos food and shelter. He built networks of blockhouses across the landscape. And he gathered Boer women, children, and elderly civilians into what his administration called concentration camps. The conditions inside those camps were an atrocity wrapped in bureaucratic language. Overcrowded, undersupplied, and riddled with disease, they became death traps. By the war's end, roughly 28,000 Boer civilians had died in them, the vast majority of them children. African civilians, swept up in the same system, died in separate and even more neglected camps. Their deaths would receive far less attention for far longer. The British public might never have known the full truth were it not for Emily Hobhouse, a Cornish-born welfare campaigner who toured the camps in 1901 and sent back reports that were precise, evidenced, and devastating. Her findings caused a political scandal. The government tried to discredit her. Soldiers called her a traitor. A parliamentary commission eventually confirmed nearly everything she had written. The discomfort never entirely went away. The Peace of Vereeniging ended the war in May of 1902. Britain had won. The cost was staggering, not merely in the 45,000 soldiers dead from wounds and disease, but in something harder to quantify. The country that had gone to war believing in its own virtue emerged from it rather less certain. The world had watched. Critics from Europe to America to India had seen the machinery of empire stripped of its civilizing mythology. Queen Victoria herself had died in January of 1901 before the war she helped start could finally conclude. She did not see the peace. She did not see what came next. She had stood at the center of the world for so long that most people alive in 1897 had never known a Britain without her. When Victoria rode through London in June of that year to mark 60 years on the throne, the Diamond Jubilee drew crowds that stretched beyond counting. Soldiers from every corner of the empire marched in that procession. The streets shook with cheering. It seemed a moment of pure, uncomplicated triumph. But those who looked closely could see what the pageantry was designed to obscure. The Queen was 78 years old, half-blind, and moved only by wheelchair. She no longer rode in an open carriage but sat enclosed, a small, stout figure in black, acknowledging the roar of her people with small, deliberate nods. The empire celebrated itself. Its queen endured the celebration. The years that followed were a long, slow diminishment. Victoria retreated increasingly to Osborne House, her beloved retreat on the Isle of Wight, built with Prince Albert in the 1840s and still full of his ghost. She had outlived most of those she loved. Her prime ministers came and went. Her health failed steadily through 1900, and by the close of that year, even those in her closest circle understood that the end was near. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House. She was 81 years old. Her family gathered around her at the last, including her grandson Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who held her in his arms as she slipped away. She had reigned for 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days, the longest of any British monarch to that point in history. The news broke over the nation like a wave. For millions of people, it was not merely the death of a monarch. It was the death of an entire framework of time. Every institution, every tradition, every postbox and coin and public building bore her mark. What did Britain look like without Victoria? Nobody living could remember. The funeral procession through London on February 2nd was a spectacle of controlled grief. Her coffin, draped in white and gold rather than the customary black, moved through streets lined with silent crowds. Kings, emperors, and princes of Europe walked behind it. The city that had cheered so loudly at the Jubilee now stood utterly still. Observers noted that the silence itself seemed to have a weight, a physical presence pressing down on the winter air. And then, almost immediately, the national mood shifted. Edward VII was 59 years old when he ascended the throne, a man his mother had long considered unsuitable for serious responsibility. He was sociable, pleasure-loving, fond of horse racing and fine food and the company of interesting women. He was, in short, the opposite of Victoria in almost every way imaginable. The change was felt at once. Osborne House was opened to the public and eventually handed to the Navy. The long decades of royal seclusion gave way to a court that was warm, visible, and deliberately modern. Edwardian Britain would be brighter, more relaxed, and considerably more complicated than the era it replaced. Yet something irreplaceable had gone. The Victorian age had given Britain railways and reform, empire and contradiction, extraordinary wealth and extraordinary squalor. It had built a nation that believed, sometimes against all evidence, in its own capacity for progress. Whether that belief was wisdom or delusion or some stubborn mixture of both was a question the new century would spend a long time answering. The 19th century was over. The 20th had begun. And the world Victoria had shaped, for better and for worse, was about to be tested in ways that even the darkest Victorian imagination had never quite conceived. The king who replaced Victoria seemed, at first glance, to promise a gentler kind of history. Edward VII presided over a Britain that wanted to enjoy itself, and for a brief, golden interval, it did. But beneath the garden parties and motor cars, the old tensions were not merely persisting. They were organizing. In 1900, the year before Victoria died, the Labour Representation Committee had been formed in a London conference hall, bringing together trade unions and socialist societies into something that would become, within 6 years, the Labour Party. For the first time, working men were not petitioning the established parties for consideration. They were building their own. Keir Hardie, who had arrived in Parliament years earlier wearing a cloth cap and a chamber full of top hats, had helped make this possible. The Victorian era had created the industrial working class. The Edwardian era would give it a political voice. That voice grew louder with extraordinary speed. The Liberal government elected in a landslide in 1906 responded with reforms that would have stunned Gladstone and horrified Disraeli. School meals for hungry children arrived in 1906. Old age pensions, modest but revolutionary, followed in 1908. National insurance against sickness and unemployment came in 1911. The state was reaching into lives it had previously ignored, and the architecture of the Victorian workhouse was beginning, brick by brick, to come down. The money had to come from somewhere. David Lloyd George's People's Budget of 1909 proposed taxing the wealthy at rates they found intolerable, using the proceeds to fund the new welfare programs. The House of Lords, still packed with landowning aristocrats, rejected it outright. The constitutional crisis that followed ended with the Parliament Act of 1911, stripping the Lords of their absolute veto. The Victorian governing class had wielded power for a century. The Edwardians had just broken its grip. Meanwhile, women were making their own furious claim on the future. Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters had founded the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903. When petitions and patience produced nothing, they turned to broken windows, arson, and hunger strikes. The government responded with force feeding in prison cells. Emily Wilding Davison died at the Epsom Derby in 1913, stepping in front of the king's horse. Victorian respectability, which had defined womanhood as quiet and domestic, was being dismantled with hammers. And beyond the Channel, a different kind of storm was gathering. Britain and Germany had been locked in a naval arms race for years, each launching dreadnoughts in anxious answer to the other. The alliances of Europe were hardening into something dangerous, and by the summer of 1914, something irreversible. The Edwardian interlude was ending. The world Victoria had built, already shaken by reform and militancy and the ambitions of nations, was about to be broken entirely. What does a dead queen leave behind? She leaves railways threading through every county, more than 15,000 miles of iron track laid by Victorian hands, still carrying commuters home tonight. She leaves sewers running beneath London, the same brick tunnels Joseph Bazalgette engineered in the 1860s, still doing their quiet, essential work. She leaves hospitals, public libraries, municipal parks, and schools, the institutional bones of a modern society built by people who believed that progress was both possible and obligatory. The Victorians did not merely inhabit the world. They constructed it, and we are still living inside their construction. Their political architecture endures just as stubbornly. The professional civil service, reformed in the 1850s and 1860s to run on merit rather than patronage, still administers the state. The Metropolitan Police, created by Robert Peel in 1829, gave the world its template for organized law enforcement. The secret ballot, competitive examinations, compulsory schooling, the slow, grudging expansion of who counted as a citizen, all of this was Victorian work. And the welfare state reforms the Edwardians began grew directly from seeds the Victorians planted. Then there is the cultural legacy, stranger and more intimate than sewers or civil servants. The Victorians invented Christmas as a domestic festival, with its decorated trees and gift-giving and sentimental warmth. They invented the detective story, giving the world Sherlock Holmes and a genre that has never stopped selling. They elevated the novel into the central art form of modern life. Dickens, Eliot, Hardy, and the Brontes were not simply entertaining readers. They were teaching millions of people how to feel, how to imagine lives unlike their own, how to demand more from the world. But no honest reckoning can stop there. The same civilization that built sewers and public libraries also drew the borders of Africa with rulers and indifference, carving nations apart or forcing enemies together, leaving wounds that bled through the 20th century and are not closed yet. The same empire that congratulated itself on abolishing the slave trade built an economic system in India and the Caribbean, and beyond that extracted wealth through coercion, famine, and force. The cotton in the mills of Manchester was picked by enslaved hands in the American South. The prosperity that funded Victorian philanthropy rested on foundations the Victorians preferred not to examine too closely. That question of who paid the price for Victorian progress is not settled. It is still being argued in parliaments and classrooms and public squares, in debates over statues and reparations and the teaching of history itself. Perhaps that is the truest measure of how much the Victorians made. We cannot simply admire them or condemn them and move on. They are too present for that, too built into the structures we inhabit and the assumptions we carry. The Victorian age ended in January of 1901. It has not finished with us yet. The Victorians reshaped every corner of the world, and we are still reckoning with the bill. Subscribe for more histories that refuse to let the past stay buried.